So at this point, we have used JavaScript to dynamically create some web page elements and then load them onto a web page. Now let's use the cloneNode method to duplicate that content, go off DOM with it, make some slight adjustments to it, and then load it back onto a web page. Let's talk about cloneNode in depth a bit. So at this point, there is a div on our web page with an ID name of outerbox1, and it contains an h1 tag, a div tag, and there's a copy inside of that h1 and div tag. What we're going to do is duplicate outerbox1 using the cloneNode method, because if we do that, it'll not only duplicate outerbox1, but all the stuff inside of it. We are going to use a jQuery.attr method to change that ID name from outerbox1 to outerbox2, because if we just make the changes and then load it onto the page without changing the ID, then that means our page will have two web page elements with the same ID, and that is a no-no. Now, inside of that div with an ID name of outerbox1 is another div with an ID name of innerbox1. For the reasons just discussed, we're going to change that ID name as well, but we're also going to add a class to it. I said in the last video that the .attr method is very powerful. I hope by my simultaneously changing an ID and adding a class, you get a hint of that power. There's that h1 tag and that inner div. They each have some copy inside of them. We're going to use plain old JavaScript to change that copy, the inner HTML properties where we're going to access to do that. And then we're going to place all this content on our web page inside of that div with an ID name of container below the content that's already there. So let's get into some code creation to do all this stuff here. So before I started recording, I added 3 variables to our single var pattern. This find div variable, this copy div variable, and this inside box variable. I added them without giving them any value, and that's okay, because it made sense to do that in order to move the video along, instead of like creating the variables below and then saying, hey, let me just add these real quick to the single var pattern. That seemed to waste time. This seemed to be a quick way to do it. We need all these variables for the cloneNode stuff. As I use them, I'll remind you that they're already on our variable list, but let's start creating some code now. So again, there's a div on our web page with an ID name of outerbox1, which we want to clone. Cloning with cloneNode, it's a 2-step process. First, you've got to find the node you actually want to clone. The second part of the process, you actually got to clone it. Let's find this element first using this find div variable. So I'm going to say, hey, find div. We want you to use document.getElementById to find the node that we want, the ID element we want to clone, and it has an ID of outerbox1. Okay, so we found the node we want to clone. Let's clone it. We're going to use the copy div variable for that up here, and then we're going to say, hey, copy div. We want you to go out and look for find div, and then when you find it, we want you to duplicate it using cloneNode. And inside of these parentheses, there needs to be a Boolean value, true or false. Do we want to clone it? Yes, we do. So that means inside of these parentheses, we have to add true. So again, copy div, it contains an h1 tag and a div tag. We actually have to find those somehow with JavaScript, and we're going to need childNodes to do that. Let's talk about some childNode stuff. So at this point, this is what we've cloned. It's off DOM, and this is just a visual representation of it. We need to find the stuff above in the first box. We need to find the childNodes of that containing box, so we can change it to look like the stuff in the image below, that box right there. So how do we find the childNodes? Well, that box with the red dashed line as for a border, it's a parent node, and at this point, it's referenced by the copy div variable. We just did that. This parent node, copy div, it's got 2 childNodes, the h1 tag and the inner div tag. Using this line of code right here, copydiv.childNodes, we can find the specific childNodes in this case, which are the h1 tag above as well as that inner div tag. Now these childNodes are going to be returned to us in the form of a JavaScript array, and each item has a unique value, which I'll show you in a second. Now by targeting these unique values with this line of code, we can change the childNodes to look and act or do, or mostly look however we want. Let's just leave it at that. There is that hello world copy up here that's inside of that box right there. Hello World is not a child node of the parent node that we've been discussing. It's actually a child node of the inner div because it's directly inside of that inner div. We are going to change that copy to say Hello World to Goodnight Moon. And we're going to do so using inner divs by targeting the inner div's HTML property. Let me give you a visual representation of what these child nodes look like. And I can do so by passing a message onto our browser console. And the way I do that is I say, hey, console.log. Look at a copy div and let us know exactly what its child nodes are. So let's fire up the browser and look at the console. And as you can see, the items in the child nodes array for copy div have been returned to us in the form of a JavaScript array. I'm assuming you have a pretty good grasp on JavaScript arrays. If you don't, please pause this video, read up on JavaScript arrays at a Mozilla Developer Network, and come back. But let's look at this array for a second. So again, this is the array of child nodes for the copy div thing in our code. There are two items, an h1 tag and a div tag. As I said, these two things have value. And if we expand this arrow here, we can see their value. Their value is actually represented by numbers, 0 and 1. So the h1 tag has a value of 0. The div has a value of 1 because computers start counting things off at a zero-based index, with a zero-based index, I should say, meaning they start counting their numbers off at 0 instead of 1. So we can target these values in our JavaScript to change them. And let's start targeting the value of the h1 tag here, which is represented by 0. And it's actually this copy up here that says hello, it says the original box. Let's have it say the clone box. So to do that in JavaScript, what would we do? We would say, hey, copy div, let's look at your array list of child nodes. Let's look at the first thing in there, which is an h1 tag and represented by that 0 we just saw. And let's access your inner HTML property. And we don't want it to say the original box. We want it to say the cloned box. Done. Now, I wrote this code out longhand, which is completely fine in this case. I could have stored it in variable, but I didn't. But now we want to access this div right here, which has a numerical value of 1. To make it easier, I am going to store that value in a JavaScript variable, and that variable is going to be inside box, which is already in our single var pattern. So I'm going to say inside box is equal to look for copy div. Look at the list of child nodes. It wants the second thing in the array, which is represented by number 1, as we can see right there. Boom. All right, so now let's change some stuff. I'm going to first change the ID of the inner box. That has an ID of inner box 1. I'm going to have it say inner box 2. Wait, do I want to do that? No, you know what? I'm going to actually change the copy first. I'm sorry. So right now that copy says hello world. I want it to say goodnight moon. So I'm going to instead say inside box, we want to look at your inner HTML property. And right now it says hello world, but we want it to say good night moon. Done. Okay, so now I'm going to change the ID of the inner box. Right now it's inner box 1. I'm going to change it to inner box 2. And this is also the element which we're going to add a class to. And we're going to use jQuery to do that. So I'm going to target inside box and call the .attr method. Oops, excuse me. Now, in the last video when we were dealing with attributes, I was only dealing with 1. We only need to worry about 2 parameters. The first parameter, what attribute do we want to affect? The ID. The second attribute, what is the value of that ID? Well, in this case, it would be inner box 2. The thing is, we are now dealing with not 1 attribute, but 2, so the syntax is going to look a little different in our code. What I have to do is construct a small JavaScript object. The attributes I want to change, affect, whatever, I have to list them in key value pairs, and those pairs have to be comma separated. So what does that code look like? Well, first of all, since it's an object, I have to wrap it up in brackets like this. And now let me just start listing out the key value pairs. Let's start with the ID. Before ID had to be in quotes, now it does not. So I'm just say ID, you are going to be equal to inner box 2. Okay, So that takes care of the ID. Excuse me. Let's take care of the class. ID may not have needed to have been in quotes. Class definitely does because it's a reserved JavaScript keyword. And if I throw class on there without wrapping it up in quotes, I'll screw stuff up. So what's the value of class? Well, that's going to be blue BG. And as a reminder, blue BG is already in our style sheet. And I'll just show it to you right there. It's this bad boy down here. It's basically going to give our inner div a background color of a sky blue type of color. Okay, so we've dealt with the inside box. Let's deal with the outside box, which has an ID at this point of outer box 1. We haven't changed it. Let's change it. Well, copy div is how that outside box is represented, and to change its ID with jQuery, we just write out our code like this, say copy div, hey, let's call the attr method, and the ID, it right now says outer box 1. We want it to say outer box 2. Okay, so we're actually done adjusting the content the way we wanted to adjust it. Let's now load it onto our web page. Now copy div, again, that's a web page element that contains all the other web page elements, and we want to load it into our div with an ID name of container, which is represented by this main node variable right here. So let's basically do the whole appendChild thing again. And that means we're going to say, hey, main node, we are going to append a child to you, and that child's name is copy div. Okay, so things should work. Let's fire up our browser and see. Yes! Okay, we should be very proud of ourselves. We did some good work here. Things are working exactly the way we want them to work. Let me close out with some resources I want you to read up on. So the main source of inspiration for this tutorial was Paul Irish's excellent HTML5, CSS3, and DOM performance screencast that he recorded about a year ago from the time I'm recording this video. Definitely go through that screencast. It's excellent. The first thing he talks about in the screencast is reflows and repaints, and he lists a couple of articles about reflows and repaints after that section. This Stoyan Stefanov article here, I think, is the best one. I want you to read all the articles, but definitely read that one. We talked about createDocumentFragment and cloneNode and appendChild. There are links to these methods pages on MDN. Please read them. Please read up on them. Excuse me. I said the jQuery.attr method is powerful. Please read up on it using that link there, which will take you to the jQuery API page. Like I said, set attribute sucks. Go to PPK's Quarks Mode blog to read more about why it's bad, but also learn about some other DOM stuff. Also, I said appendChild is buggy, particularly on IE9 and lower. Here is a link that discusses the issues with IE9. Here is a link that discusses the issues with IE8 and lower. Some very smart people, excuse me, like I said, have written about why appendChild is, but still use it anyway. It's fine. Don't worry. Yeah, read those articles. This article here, it's not directly related to the stuff we've been talking about, but you should read it anyway. Tali Garciel, who is a web developer in Israel, did a ton of research on browser internals. She went through browsers with a fine-tooth comb, man, and she just, shared her findings in this article. The article is long, and it's verbose, and you'll probably have to read it twice, and it's one of the best web developer anything articles I've ever read in my life. Please read up on it. You will be the better web developer for it. Okay, so that's it. We're done. If you have any questions, hit me up on my blog or hit me up on Twitter. That's actually the quickest way to find me. Nowadays it is. All right, that's it. Thanks for sticking with me through this screencast tutorial. Take care.